Hello and welcome to another episode of Kings of History, a podcast where we will talk about all the kings of Portugal in chronological order. In the last episode, we learned about the troubled history of the Iberian Peninsula, from the fall of the Visigothic kingdom until 1109, amidst intrigues, battles, discord between brothers, and constant mutual aggression between Christians and Muslims. It is finally time to meet the one who would become Afonso I of Portugal, or, as he is better known, Afonso Henriques, his relationship with his mother Teresa, and all the adventures of a young warrior leaving his nest. Before we proceed, we would like to remind you all that you can listen to every single episode released so far on our website, kingsofhistory.buzzsprout.com, as well as on the most common podcasting platforms. You can also follow us on social media so that you are always updated regarding new releases and other fun things as well. Drop a follow and a like, it helps a lot. Let's resume our narration, shall we? We are now in 1109. Count Henry is married to Teresa, and they both control the counties of Portugal and Coimbra, a territorial union which we call the Second County of Portugal, or just the County of Portugal. While Afonso I of Aragon is married to Urraca, and they both control practically all of the Christian territory on the Iberian Peninsula. It is in the same year that Count Henry's fifth son is born. Yes, you guessed it. This son is called Afonso Henriques. The birthplace is hotly disputed between Coimbra and Viseu. Coimbra because that's where the Counts of Portugal spent a lot of their time, and Viseu because the local documentation contemporary to the king attributed the month of August of 1109 to his birth date. Also, Teresa spent many months of that year in this square, the latter being the most plausible. Just don't tell this to the people of Guimarães, they might not take it very well. Let's go a little bit back to the marriage of Urraca and Afonso I of Aragon. It wasn't the happiest of marriages, and many nobles, including Henry, took advantage of this to increase their power, either by supporting one or the other or even a third party, which was the young Afonso, who eventually would become Afonso VII, son of Urraca's first marriage to the late Raymond of Galicia, who, with his mother's second marriage, found himself somewhat left out of the territories of Leon and Castile. Not because he would be left without the inheritance of his mother's titles, but because, with this marriage, Afonso I of Aragon could take advantage of his power to try and spread his influence and eventually take over all the Christian territory on the Iberian Peninsula, and pass on his patrimony to his descendants in case he would have any in the future. Urraca was finding it very difficult to keep her land from falling into disarray, and even ended up losing Galicia, which essentially became an independent kingdom under the rule of her very young son Afonso. On top of this, her husband, Afonso I of Aragon, started sporadic wars against her over the border territories between Castile and Aragon. It is evident that this marriage had no legs to stand on, and eventually was even annulled by Pope Pascal in October of 1114. At this time, Henry was in the last years of his life, but because of the support he gave to the recently separated Urraca in her quarrels with her husband, he ended up receiving the lordships of Astorga and Zamora in gratitude. But at this point, Henry had himself lost territory to the south to the Almoravids, specifically Santarém and Sintra, and the Christian border retreated as far north as the Mondego River. And so we arrive in the year 1112, the year in which, on the 24th of April, Henry died and left Afonso Henriques was about 2 or 3 years old, and the wife, Teresa, who would continue her now deceased husband's work of trying to obtain as much autonomy as possible. Afonso Henriques would spend his childhood years being educated by a nobleman, but which one, we cannot say for sure. Studies point to a man-at-arms, Egas Muniz, others to his brother, Irmígio Muniz, and there is also the hypothesis that it was the Archbishop of Braga, Paio Mendes. According to legend steeped in mysticism, when Afonso Henriques was still very young, he had a serious disability in his legs that would prevent him from horse riding when he grew up. But this disability was miraculously cured by the act of Saint Mary of Cradle. The curious thing is that the monastery with the same name, which still exists today around Rezende, was in the core of the Muniz family's lands from the Rivadouro family lineage. So, this legend only benefits them. We've now reached the year 1114, the year in which the marriage between Urraca and Alfonso I of Aragon was annulled, and since they hadn't produced an heir to the kingdom of Leon and Castile, Urraca's son Alfonso would now finally have some peace of mind, knowing that his rights to his mother's titles were secure. Going back to the family of Afonso Henriques, Teresa, Henry's recent widow, named herself Regina, an equivalent to Queen, in 1117, which basically meant she was the sole mistress of her territory, and she did this because she wanted to rule the county of Portugal free from the influence of her sister, Urraca of Leon and Castile, and her son, Teresa's nephew, Alfonso of Galicia. To this end, she teamed up with the very powerful Trava family, maintaining romantic relations with brothers Fernão Trava and Bermudo Trava, the latter of whom would later marry the eldest daughter of Teresa herself, Urraca Henriques, sister of Afonso Henriques. This rapprochement with the Trava family was due to the fact that they wanted to get out from under Alfonso of Galicia, and they also wanted to convince Teresa to covet the territories of Toledo and Galicia. Around this time, a conflict arose in the church over ecclesiastical supremacy in the northwest of the Iberian Peninsula, between Santiago de Compostela and Braga. Let's see, this conflict is due to the fact that Santiago took on enormous importance once the tomb of the Apostle James the Great was revealed to be there, something that not only gave Santiago de Compostela enormous ecclesiastical prestige, but also the fact that in the 11th century, the belief was that Santiago was the patron of the holy war between Christians and Muslims, and also the fact that it was the only apostolic diocese in the West, alongside with Rome, that had relics of an apostle. Rome had St. Peter, Santiago had St. James the Great. Diego Gelmírez had been Bishop of Santiago since 1101, and he politically defended the autonomy of Galicia as well as defending and assuming the protection of Alfonso, now King of Galicia. In 1113, Diego appointed Hugo to the Cathedra of Porto. This ingenious machination was met with praise since Hugo had previously been a canon in Santiago de Compostela and was a great ally of his. Furthermore, Porto was a diocese dependent on the Archdiocese of Braga, but the bishops of Braga could not accept such an affront. A few years later, in 1120, Diego Gelmírez succeeded in elevating Santiago de Compostela to the rank of archdiocese, thus freeing himself completely from Braga's political control and obtaining the rights over the dioceses that had belonged to the Archdiocese of Mérida, which was still Muslim, as well as self-promotion to papal legate over these provinces. But what does this all mean? Basically, Diego got Santiago de Compostela elevated to the rank of archdiocese, which, in the church hierarchy, was only below Rome, so that Braga no longer had political control over Santiago. He also got Santiago to be considered the papal representation in these regions. This political struggle was opposed by Bishop Paio Mendes and later by Bishop João Peculiar, both from Braga. The elevation of Santiago can be contextualized. A year before these events, in 1119, Pope Calixtus II was elected. He was the brother of the late Raymond of Burgundy and uncle of Alfonso of Galicia. Diego Gelmírez, being Alfonso's protector, took advantage of the situation to obtain the rights to the dioceses of Lusitania in 1120. At the same time, Paio Mendes was suspended from his duties for allegedly misappropriating the belongings of Santiago, and Hugo defended the Galicians before the Pope. It was also around this time that the decline of the Almoravid Empire began, led at the time by the Emir Ali ibn Yusuf, whose capital was Marrakesh. Further north, during Teresa's absence on her visits to the Trava brothers, Urraca and Diego Gelmírez allied themselves for the sole reason that they had enemies in common, the Trava family, and they invaded the Portuguese territory in April of 1120. By Portuguese lands, we are referring to the county of Porto, ruled by Teresa, and forced her to entrench herself in the castle of Lanhoso, having been subjected and forced to cede the lordship of the city of Porto to Hugo. Porto would remain the central hub of its bishops until the beginning of the 15th century, and would be the cause of the main rifts between the Portuguese crown and the Catholic Church during centuries to come. But after this disagreement between sisters, they ended up reconciling, and Gelmírez was arrested by Urraca's orders. Yes, they had been allies against the Trava family, but she didn't exactly trust him. On the other hand, Teresa sided with Pedro Trava and his sons against Gelmírez's ambitions, and this is where the strong bond between Teresa and the Trava family began. Between 1121 and 1128, we start to notice the influence and inclusion of the Trava family in the county of Porto, with Fernão Pérez de Trava being Teresa's right-hand man. Not only did he take on the role of lieutenant of the castles in the Mondego River basin, but he also confirmed Teresa's documentation. What this meant was that the nobles of Porto were increasingly being pushed away from the court, and, as you can imagine, they didn't like this situation very much, and they didn't look favorably on this foreign family either. Reports say that during this period, between 1123 and 1125, the young Afonso Henriques, aged around 15, knighted himself with his mother's permission at a ceremony in Zamora, which was part of Teresa's domains. It was a tradition already well rooted in the peninsula. The king knights his sons and, in the absence of a father, a king or would-be king knights himself. This is a clear demonstration that Afonso, as the grandson of Alfonso VI, aspired to more than just the title of count. It was quite possibly at this moment that the Portuguese nobles saw in Afonso Henriques an ally that they could use to counter the increasingly strong presence of the Trava family at the court of the county of Porto. We can also state that Afonso Henriques wasn't too keen on this new Galician influence of the Trava family either. We arrive now in 1126, when Urraca, Queen of Castile and Leon, dies, causing her son, Alfonso of Galicia, aged 21, to inherit his mother's titles, now known as Alfonso VII, who now held the kingdoms of Galicia, Castile, and Leon. Teresa, without wasting too much time, went to Ribacoyo, a square near Zamora, to dispute with the now Afonso VII about his inheritance from his grandfather Afonso VI. But the only fruitful outcome of this meeting between aunt and nephew was a temporary peace agreement. The following year, in 1127, Afonso VII had already managed to get most of the lords of his kingdom to pay homage to him and recognize him as their new king, through diplomacy or even force. Teresa belonged to the group that had hesitated to do so, which is why the king invaded Portuguese lands to subdue his aunt. What he found on arrival was Afonso Henriques, aged around 17 or 18, defending Guimarães, the former seat of power of the county. Regardless of who it was, the fact was that the county was being invaded, and Afonso Henriques was just defending it. He was only defending what was his mother's, and, in the future, what would be his. As we said a little earlier, tradition has it that Afonso Henriques had Egas Muniz as his servant and educator, although some researchers have also suggested his brother Irmígio Muniz. During the siege of Guimarães, Egas was involved in the peace negotiations between the cousins that ended the siege in 1127, having promised in his lord's name obedience and vassalage to his cousin Afonso VII as an act of surrender. This nobleman would have, according to legend, presented himself wearing a noose around his neck before the Leonese king Afonso VII and his family. We can say that Afonso Henriques' educator was a Portuguese nobleman with some prestige because he conducted the negotiations between the cousins, which only someone of importance could do. We can also see that after this, Afonso Henriques had more and more people on his side, mainly Portuguese nobles who didn't want to lose their autonomy to the Trava family. His action, stimulated by the nobles from Porto who were now accompanying him, was clear. On the one hand, to free the county from the harmful influence of the Galicians, even if he had to remove his mother from the picture in the process, and, on the other hand, to continue with his father's policy regarding the autonomy and perhaps independence of his domains from Leon. After the siege of Guimarães, everything changes. The price of peace is that Teresa gives up the terms of Astorga and Zamora, which escaped the control of Portugal, and Afonso Henriques, who, after the siege, was seen by the nobles of Porto as the only figure capable of effectively resisting the king, was already displaying some count-like behavior by confirming documentation, and thus assumed a more relevant and controlled position, which meant that he began to gather logistical and military support from the nobles of Porto, who were very unhappy with the influence of the Trava family and with Teresa. Now, we will get to know the Order of the Knights Templar. And why is that? At the time, it had been in existence for less than 10 years, and there's a lot of debate as to whether it was actually in Portugal that it received its first commendation outside the Holy Land. In any case, while Europe and the Pope were discussing its recognition at the Council of Troyes, on the 19th of March of 1128, Teresa gave the castle of Soure to the Templars there present. Thus, the defensive belt protecting Coimbra was strengthened by the presence of these warrior monks, and the temple's oldest and most enduring connection to a country was firmly established. It should be said that the Order of the Temple and its successor, the Order of Christ, existed in the Portuguese region as entities until the reforms of the Enlightenment in the 18th century. On the 24th of June, 1128, the inevitable happens. After so much tension between the nobles of Porto, led by Afonso Henriques, and Teresa, supported by the Trava family, the two sides clashed in a pitched battle in the fields of São Mamed. On one side we have Teresa, nearing 50 years of age, her troops under the command of the Trava family gathered in the areas of Viseu and Coimbra. On the other, we have Afonso Henriques, aged 18 or 19, marching with his troops and his allies from between the Douro and Minho region to Guimarães. Legend has it that during the battle, Afonso Henriques fled the field of battle right after the first clashes and was brought back by either Soeiro Mendes da Maia or Egas Muniz, and that the young Afonso's courage prevailed and the battle was won against his own mother. Such narratives form part of the stories of the descendants of these families in order to magnify their prestige and claim part of the glory of the founding of Portugal for themselves. Once the battle was won, Afonso Henriques imprisoned his mother and the Trava family members and began a policy of thanking the church, especially Braga, and his allies, also nominating Irmígio or Egas Muniz chief steward of his court. However, he didn't overdo it with the rewards, which meant that this newly obtained power didn't become too fragmented, and Portugal was built from an early stage as the centralized entity it would never cease to be. With this diligence, he ensured that these nobles didn't have too much power, avoiding the spawning of factions comprised of some of the more ambitious noblemen. Let's face it, at the time, allies were only for political interests or conquest. After the Battle of São Mamede, the county of Portugal became the sum of the counties of Portugal and Coimbra, separated only by the Douro River. At the time, Afonso Henriques was a count who called himself a prince, and the documents written at his court began to be validated with the use of the word Portugal over a cross, star, or fleuron. We can see this representation on the 1, 2, and 5 cent euro coins minted in Portugal. This and the fact that the noun Portugalesium is attributed to the lords of its territory helps to foster the collective consciousness of a nation. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't his cousin Afonso VII do anything about this? He was his liege, after all. The truth is that he was aware of what was going on in the county of Portugal, and one possible reason of why he didn't get involved in this real coup d'etat was that Teresa was seen as someone really dangerous and manipulative. So it would be much easier to control his cousin Afonso Henriques, a young man without much experience. Besides, he had already paid homage and sworn vassalage through Egas Muniz. Meanwhile, in 1130, Afonso Henriques wanted to secure greater prestige than just being a simple count. So he allied himself with a strong church power, Paio Mendes, Archbishop of Braga, who had taken advantage of the death of the Bishop of Coimbra that same year to consecrate his successor, Bernard. But Coimbra belonged to the metropolitan province of Mérida, whose rights belonged to the Archdiocese of Santiago de Compostela since 1120. So, Diego de Almires, Archbishop of Santiago, complained to Afonso VII and even to Rome, but to no avail. Paio Mendes manages to secure the position of Bishop of Coimbra for Bernard. We are now in the year 1131, and Afonso Henriques moves to Coimbra. This decision was of great importance, as it ensured that the county remained a strong, centralized, and independent political entity. But there were more reasons for this to happen, such as this move definitively merged the two political entities that made up the Henrician lordship, the county of Coimbra and Portugal. Another reason was the fact that Coimbra was a larger and more developed city than the population centers of the north. Coimbra was, at the time, a huge city in the context of the Western Peninsula, with around 22 hectares within its walls, larger than Lisbon, which only had 16, and Porto, which was once described as a dull, diminutive wall high up around a small hill, which wasn't even 4 hectares. But we mustn't forget one very important reason. Coimbra was located just a few kilometers from the fickle border between the Christians and Muslim Almoravids. One of the reasons Galicia was absorbed and ceased to exist as a kingdom has to do with the fact that it lost its border with the Moors when Portugal became independent. And the same would later happen to Leon and then Navarre. As soon as Afonso Henriques arrived in Coimbra, he sponsored the foundation of the Monastery of the Holy Cross on the 28th of July, 1131. Here was where the main royal documents of the first kings of Portugal were written, but also inspired some collaborators in the national dioceses, such as João Peculiar, who would soon be Bishop of Porto and later Archbishop of Braga. Afonso Henriques didn't want the Kingdom of Galicia like his mother did. He just wanted to be owed the rights of lord so that he could have his own vassals. And the lords of Galicia gave him all what was needed for this to happen, because they wanted to get rid of the stronger authority of Alfonso VII and start paying vassalage to the smaller power of Afonso Henriques so that they themselves could obtain more autonomy. 3 years later, in 1134, Alfonso I of Aragon, the battler, died without successors, and now Aragon and Pamplona were without a king. The dispute between the kingdoms was decided by the coronation of Garcia Ramirez, grandson of Garcia Sanchez III and great-grandson of Sancho Garces III, to the throne of Pamplona, which from now on would be called the Kingdom of Navarre. And to the throne of Aragon, Ramiro, brother of the recently deceased Alfonso I of Aragon, that almost had to be dragged out of the monastery where he had become a monk in. Both thrones were obliged to pay vassalage to Alfonso VII, who now became lord of all Christian territory in the Iberian Peninsula. As such, in the following year, on the 22nd of May, 1135, in the assemblies held in the Cathedral of Leon, Alfonso VII was officially acclaimed Emperor of all Hispania, thus becoming a true reference point in Europe and the holder of enormous prestige. Further south, the Reconquista seemed to have stalled for many years, and the conflicts along the border were small-scale raids aimed only at looting and devastating small portions of enemy land. There were border communities whose main source of income was by raiding others. Afonso Henriques, after moving the court to Coimbra, relied on a class known as Knight Villains. Of unknown origin, they stood out for being able to afford a diverse arsenal of weapons and cavalry. They were members of the plebe, but had certain privileges that made them a favorite group within the people. And it was these same people who covered the costs of the raids in the war against the Moors during the first years of Afonso Henriques' rule. As a city close to the border, Coimbra was vulnerable. The Almoravid attacks of 1116 and 1117 on the garrisons and castles around the city, which culminated in the siege of its walls, proved that the system was fragile, and that it would only take a day's march for an army to reach the city. These weaknesses were not overlooked by Afonso Henriques, who turned his attention to a strategic point on the banks of the river Liege, occupying the hill of Leiria, and later, in 1135, building a castle there. This was clearly a strategy to protect Coimbra, since Santarém and Lisbon were the two major centers from which the Almoravid military expeditions to Coimbra departed from, and the main corridor to the north passed through the vicinity of what was then Leirena. This castle was mainly used to try and neutralize these attacks and made this region the spearhead for the next phase of the war. From 1140 onwards, it would become the starting point for the Portuguese expeditions that were increasingly close to the great square of Santarém. We have to bear in mind that the construction of a castle would not only serve military or defense purposes. Of course, these were its main functions, but the truth is that its construction caused a population and economic development around it, taking advantage of the structure for its protection, and, as we know at this time, there were no well-defined borders. The territory was defined by the settlements and the plots dependent on them. By occupying a place with a castle, Afonso Henriques, in practice, ensured control of all the surrounding territory, consolidating it under his rule. Some Central European historians define territorial possession as the amount of land around a stronghold that a cavalry regiment could cover in one day. Although this wasn't a rule or even thought of by the people of Afonso Henriques' time, in practice, it gives us an idea of what the reality was like. In 1137, Afonso Henriques invaded Galicia via Minho and occupied Tui. This invasion provoked a response from Alfonso VII's Galician allies, one of whom was the well-known Fernão Pérez de Trava. They were defeated at the Battle of Cerneja. The reasons behind this invasion were not the conquest of Galicia, but rather Afonso Henriques' attempt to secure vassals in territories outside his original influence, since, at the time, a sovereign's power was measured above all by the extent of his territory and the number of vassals it contained. At the same time, he received news that a Portuguese contingent had been defeated by the river Nabão, near what now is Tomar, and that the Moors had besieged and dismantled the castle of Leiria, which had been built around 1135. And so, Afonso Henriques sought to sign an urgent pact with his cousin Alfonso VII so that he could head south without wasting any more time, thus giving up his victory at Cerneja. As such, Alfonso VII met with Afonso Henriques to form the Pact of Tui. The conditions agreed upon were extremely favorable for the Leonese and unattractive for the Portuguese. Afonso Henriques accepted them because not only were his southern borders and his capital at risk, but also because he saw no problem in recognizing his cousin Alfonso VII as a higher authority, as long as this guaranteed him some autonomy in the south, and perhaps eventually a title higher than just Count. And now we've reached the end of the second episode, where we've learned about the first steps in the life of King Afonso Henriques, Teresa's growing love affair with the Trava family, the decline of the Almoravid Empire, and the death of Urraca, who gave way to her son, now Alfonso VII, King of Castile and Leon. We also saw Afonso Henriques defend Guimarães against his cousin Alfonso VII, as well as the inevitable Battle of São Mamed between Afonso Henriques and his mother Teresa. In the next episode, we'll learn about two battles that were very important for the formation of Portugal, and we'll also see a new Moroccan sect that is growing rapidly. We'll also see King Afonso Henriques sort out his marital situation before setting off on his raids to the south. We'll see you in the next episode. Take care, kings and queens.